Before we go further, let's go back. We covered a lot of ground last week, at least ground probably unfamiliar to most of us. So, those of you who were here, I want to ask you to talk about what was interesting, what was concerning, what was challenging. Let's take a couple of minutes as a way of kind of reviewing, and we'll then move forward to all these things up here on the board, which I'm sure none of you are aware of. So let's talk about last Sunday. What were your reflections, reactions?
I'm surprised we got to this point from the way they were.
Given where we started, it's really...
Well, not where we started, where they, after, I mean, just like, you know, this church doing this church doing that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, we're going to get a lot more of that before we get less of that. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that Q was a collection of sayings or stories. And I always assumed it was kind of the basic draft of the others that were drawn from.
No. Yeah. No. It's like a bunch of stories that you cherry picked. Other thoughts?
I have a sort of a question. Maybe you're going to go over this. You talked about how different people, they had different Bibles or different, they used Matthew or, you know, or Luke or whatever. And you got all these letters from Paul that are in the Bible, okay? And, I mean, he wrote them to the different churches, but I'm assuming that there's more than one, maybe not. Maybe where he wrote the letter was to one particular church in Corinth or in Rome or wherever he wrote the letter to, and that they survived.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? Yeah.
That's what they, you know, they didn't have like, you know, Xerox copies.
Yeah. Well, they survived, although they survived in different versions. And then eventually you had to say, well, is this version of the Paul's letter to Corinth better than that version?
Okay, so they had to make a decision.
Yeah,
okay,
and interestingly enough, that's something I hadn't really put in my notes, but one of the ways to become really well-liked was for you to write a letter to the church in Corinth or Ephesus. Because since they had already received this letter from Paul, they got a letter from you. That made you pretty important. And so what we'll see is there are hundreds and hundreds of letters, some of them to churches that, you know, Paul had written to. But it was a way to become famous. Other thoughts about last Sunday?
You know, you said that the different gospels were written in different languages a lot of times.
Well, they all written in
for
Greek.
Different audiences.
For different audiences, yeah. We're going to talk about that today. That's where we're going to start in a minute. Yeah. Well, you aren't as worried, troubled, or confused as I feared you are, so that's good. So now we'll plunge ahead into the really strange stuff, okay? If you were a leader of a congregation, let's just pick round numbers. Let's say in the year 100, all right? That's about where we got to last week. So you're a leader of a congregation in 95 or 100, and what would you use to help your congregation come together, understand what Jesus is all about, understand what God is doing in the world? Well, you had a number of choices, and as I list the choices, recall that some congregations nixed some of these and only chose others, and so there were so many choices that you get different congregations. So you could start off with Old Testament literature, especially if your church was in Jerusalem or in Samaria. You had all that kind of common stuff. So you had Old Testament. Then you had Jewish traditions. You had Passover traditions. You had other things that everybody knew, and that could help bind you together. You had some people in your congregation who actually had actually talked to a disciple. That was pretty significant. You may have had some people in your congregation that had been the first one to hear about one of Paul's letters. So that's a pretty significant part of your congregation. And of course, they could talk to others about that. You may have had somebody in your congregation who had copied one of Paul's letters. Then you had other things written that you came across that now here, 20-some centuries later, we don't even know what they were, but there are things that your congregation held to be precious that have been lost to time, of course. And then you have what we have come to call Matthew, Mark, or Luke. You have personal testimonies of people who have had an encounter with God or with Jesus. And so those testimonies become stories that you pass around in your congregation. And of course, then you have people who find one another and they find they had the same way of seeing a story or seeing Paul's letters. And so you start to get different views in your congregation. And at first, that seems fine. Variety is the spice of life. And it seems great that we have people who are starting to share with one another, even if they have slightly different views. So that's where you are as a congregation in, let's say, the year 100. And let's talk about one of the things that we, looking back, think was the most important thing your congregation could have had, and that is some knowledge or maybe even possession of one of the Gospels. At the year 100, John wasn't around yet, so it'd be Mark, Matthew, and Luke. I'll start, first of all, by talking about how they got their name, because in the year 100, they didn't have a name. So Mark, where did Mark's name? John Mark, was one of the travelers with Paul. And people got to know of John Mark. He was younger than Paul. He outlived Paul. And so the first gospel that we know about was named after him in about the year 180 or so. So the Gospels went through something more than 100 years without a given name. I have no idea how they were called before they were given names. So we have Mark. Then we have Matthew. Matthew was, of course, the tax collector, right? One of the disciples. Early on, the Gospel of Matthew was called the Jewish Gospel. And so it was named after, clearly, a Jew. It was named after Matthew. Then we get to Luke. Luke was the physician. Luke traveled with Paul. And although Luke isn't named in any of Paul's letters, the Gospel of Luke was named after him because Luke was seen as having kind of the broadest horizon, the widest scope. You heard some stories from Luke this morning, the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. Those stories are in no other Gospels, right? So it points out that when we get to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you had portions of them in your congregation, you'd use all of them because all of them had different things to say to you. And you probably knew them by one of the stories. You may know Luke by the lost coin. That may be what you call it, if you have all of it. So Mark had how many chapters? I got it here somewhere. Here it is. Mark had 16 chapters. It was short. Matthew, 28 chapters. Luke, 24 chapters. And finally, John, that comes a little later, 21 chapters. They were very different in the way they presented things. So let me talk just a little about each one to give you something to hang your hat on. We'll start with Mark. Mark is the shortest gospel. It was the one most easily read. It was the one most easily kept together. It had the longer stories. There were fewer stories, but they were longer. Because what Mark seemed to be about was presenting Jesus as both somebody known and at the same time somebody unknown. Mark contained what scholars call the messianic secret. The messianic secret is, the question Mark raises over and over again, is Jesus who? The Messiah. And Mark writes Jesus to be very cagey about it, very cagey about it. And only at the very end, when Jesus sort of rides off into the sunset, if you will, do those questions come up, because Jesus never answers yes or no. Never at all. So it's an open-ended kind of thing with Mark. So Mark portrays Jesus as enigmatic, as somebody you understand and then somebody you kind of wonder about, all at the same. He's mysterious. That's probably the best word for Mark's Jesus. The other thing about Mark is everything is done in a hurry. Not only is it short, but we leap from one story to the next story to the next story. It goes on like that. And then all of a sudden he'll slow down for a longer story. And Mark ends, as I've said before, very abruptly. When you go to the tomb, Jesus is not there. Done. That's the story. Well, so we get to the next one, probably Matthew. And Matthew now has at the beginning a story about Jesus' birth, a virgin birth. Very important to Matthew. In this one, you may not have noticed, but Mary and Joseph live in Bethlehem. They live there. They don't go there, they live there. They make no journey. Joseph, the father, is a descendant of King David. Joseph is a royal guy. He's the heart and soul. He's the midst of being Jewish. The writer's concern in Matthew is the charge that Jesus had no father. He was illegitimate. Matthew decides the first thing he's got to do is give this guy some legitimacy. Jesus is born somehow with all the Sadducees and Pharisees around watching. I mean, he's born into the heart of Judaism. So there's no questions about his mother, his father, his legitimacy. He's the real deal. So Matthew gets us started with a kind of foundation in which we feel, oh, well, that's good to hear. We like that, especially if we're Jewish. We like that a great deal. And then the other thing Matthew does is he gives us this long genealogy. The genealogy starts with Abraham, and it goes on through to David, and then from David to Solomon and on through to Joseph. Except that 5 or 6 generations before Joseph, instead of all these men, we have 4 women in the genealogy. Where did they come from? Their names you probably don't know. They're not married to anybody you've heard of. And what are they doing there? All these 4 women, if you finally find them obscurely in the text in the Bible, all these 4 women were engaged in some kind of sexual scandal. Honestly. So we have on the one hand this Jesus so legitimate, and on the other hand his heritage that Matthew so clearly points out has this kind of section in it that, what do you do with that? You know? The other thing that Matthew does is get rid of all this enigmatic stuff about Jesus, who he is, and you can't quite understand him. Jesus is somebody who is squarely clear about who he is and what this is all about. There's no details about Jesus being cagey or vulnerable. There's no details about the disciples not understanding and wondering what's going on. Oh, that's gone. You're now on rock solid ground with Matthew. You can proceed. But there's these women. I don't know. The other thing is that Matthew ends the speeches at the crucifixion with, what does Jesus say on the cross? Remember? Why have you forsaken me? This is a very suffering kind of thing. And it's typical of Matthew. He quotes Psalm 22 is what he's doing. So he's quoting a piece of Jewish literature that is well known. And he's being very Jewish, and yet it appears that Jesus is really suffering and has his own doubts on the cross. So that's Matthew. Then we come to Luke. Luke. The birth now is there. It's from a virgin, but where is it? It's out in the countryside, right? It's in this little, whatever it is, in this place, in this tiny little city. It's in a stable. It's a very rural kind of experience. And yet Luke was always thought of as the kind of the sophisticated guy. Luke was from Antioch, where it was a cosmopolitan kind of place. And yet Jesus and his family come out in the hinterlands of Bethlehem, a place they have to go to, a place that they've only been before because there's this odd connection between Joseph and needing to be taxed and all this. Of course, if you study history, there was no tax. So somehow Luke, as all the others did, they had stories that were true, and then they had other stories that maybe they worked well for them, but maybe that isn't quite the way it really was. Now, Luke has a genealogy too. But Luke's genealogy starts with Jesus, and then it goes backward, and it goes back all the way, not to Abraham, but to Adam. It goes back to the beginning of mankind. So Luke is, encompassing all of known human history. And Jesus is a descendant of this human history, not necessarily a descendant only of King David or Abraham or Solomon, but Jesus is, in some sense, like you and I, a descendant of Abraham. There are no stories about Jesus telling the future of the kingdom. In Luke, everything is now. It's happening now. A story that's told is a story that happened recently. Even though we're in about the year 90 or 95, there's a kind of presence here of something alive and bubbling along. And at the crucifixion, what does Jesus say? Not, why have thou forsaken me? But it's from Psalm 33 about, what is it? Why can't I find it here? About, into your hands I commend my soul. A very personal kind of, something that you can even picture yourself experiencing, that kind of business. The other thing that's going on here in both Matthew and Luke, compared to Mark, is the criticism that had come up was that Jesus had made his own bed, he should lie in it. He had challenged the authorities, he had turned over the table in the temple, he had done all these things, and he got crucified. Well, all right, that's what happens, isn't it? People that cause trouble get in trouble. And so one of the things that Matthew and Luke are going to do is take all these stories about who was what where at the time of Jesus being arrested in the garden and dragged before various people. All these stories are going to be spun out so that what you start to think is that Jesus is the victim. he's not the fool. He's not the guy that should have known better. Behaving like that, don't you think he'd get crucified? No, he's the one that various folks conspired against him. In one, it's the crowd. The crowd shouted to Pilate, "Bring us Barabbas!" And Pilate, poor Pilate, what was he to do? He didn't have anything. So he brought out Barabbas and sent Jesus off to be crucified. So the stories get very complex and thick here at the ends in Matthew and Luke. Think about exactly who was in charge here and how was this thing happening? It seemed to be kind of careening out of control, and nobody could control it, and certainly Jesus couldn't control it, so he's more the innocent party. A result of the fact that Mark didn't really dwell on any of this, and so we get these adaptations to the story as 30, 40 years go on. And finally, let's get to John. John comes out in the year 105, maybe. John comes, the gospel comes, probably written in Ephesus in Turkey, or in what we call Asia Minor, a place not anywhere near where the other gospels came from. And it comes from a time also, maybe 35, 40 years removed from Mark, certainly 10, 20 years removed from Matthew and Luke. And so it comes, in a sense, as the church and its views have evolved, we've learned some things. We found what seems to touch people and what things seem to kind of get lost and sloughed off. And so John comes, and he comes in a form that is not anything like Mark or Matthew or Luke. It's not really a biography. How does it begin? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was in God. It's got all this kind of Greek philosophy. He's turning into a theology. And it's that Jesus is kind of part of this universal kind of picture that John is painting. And Jesus comes straight from God. There's no messianic secret. There's no question about who Jesus was. Jesus is like God. Jesus and God are, coterminous. And so we get stories, and we get symbolic kind of things. We get 7 signs that Jesus does. And we get 7 stories of kind of unusual things going on. But all of it is about the competition between this glorious world that God makes and this evil world in which Jesus and the rest of us have to dwell. So it's a cosmological kind of fight between good and evil. Jesus represents good. Jesus comes from God. Jesus is the Son of God. There's just no doubt about any of these things. As the church has moved on, you see it's evolved. It's gotten to a place now where this question about who Jesus is, we're going to settle once and for all, and John decides he'll settle it for us. And those that embrace this gospel embrace John and embrace this notion of Jesus now has a much clearer identity. Not all the churches come to this, not all the churches have read John's gospel, but you can see the evolution of the questions that got raised and then writers trying to answer them, trying to give us some sense of what a previous gospel writer hadn't quite fleshed out enough for us. The next one tries to give us a little more flesh on the bone. So leaders in congregation collect these writings. They may only collect what's available in their region, but they encourage their members to read these kinds of things. They encourage their members to give testimony, because what is starting to go on is there are those among them who aren't they aren't satisfied that this is the end. Jesus was crucified, but it's not the end. We're starting to talk about resurrection appearances. And so we get some folks that start spinning theories and theologies that frankly get to be troubling because, well, they just, at their bone, don't seem quite legit, but they start to divide congregations. People start to hear these particular voices. I'll talk about them in a minute. And they start to say, well, wait a minute, you know, maybe we don't have all the story here. Maybe there's more to it. And so we have a number of what come to be called heresies, but they start out as sort of part of this whole evolution of what is this faith and who is this Jesus, gotten written up here. We start with the first one that is called Montanism, from a fellow named Montan. But he comes in a time in which, let's say in about the year 105, about the same year that John's Gospel starts to circulate, there are several bishops in the church, and these bishops, people that either have elected themselves or kind of been informally elected to be important leaders. 3 of the bishops have all itinerated or have all traveled around with one of the disciples. 2 of them with Paul and 1 with Matthew. So we have these people that have known those who have known Jesus. They themselves haven't, but there are 3 bishops I want to name: St. Ignatius of Antioch, because these will be the ones that have to figure out what to say about these. So we have Ignatius of Antioch. What did we say about Antioch? It's the cosmopolitan place. It's the place probably from which Matthew and Luke began. It's an important place in Christianity at this period in time. And so we have Bishop Ignatius. We have Bishop Polycarp. Aren't these names wonderful? Polycarp. Who would ever name their child that? We have Bishop Polycarp, who was in Smyrna, a bit of an out-of-the-way place, but in Asia Minor. And finally, we have the third and probably the most important bishop to our story is Barnabas, and he's in Rome. All these bishops now are known in the Roman Catholic Church as Saint so-and-so, Saint Ignatius, Saint, etc. But Barnabas, of the 3, Barnabas was one for writing letters. And Barnabas' first letter is written to a place you've heard of. He writes a letter to Corinth. How about that? So we have Barnabas writing to Corinth, and he quotes Matthew, and he quotes Mark, and he quotes Luke. Now, he doesn't name them that because they haven't been named yet, but here's a guy that is fairly wide-read. He's going to be one of the players that when he speaks, people listens, because he's written letters to these places. People have read these letters, they know him. So with the kind of sense that now there's a bit of a hierarchy, there's a bit of an order to the church, we now have these folks, starting with Montanism, who are going to start to say things that bother these bishops. Montan claimed that he had new revelations of prophecies that had been given to him. Some of those prophecies were that there should be a great deal of fasting. A prophecy was that marriage should be discouraged. A prophecy that martyrdom was central to the faith, and if one died for the faith, that was a good thing. And Montan was the first one that started to suggest that the kind of things that he saw and wrote about was an extension of what we know in the Gospels. In other words, there's more to it. There's ongoing things in this faith. And the new revelations are some of these. Don't get married. Fast a great deal. Die for the faith. They were eclipsing the Gospels, if you were. And they were, in a sense, creating a movement beyond Jesus' ministry. They were now going to do things following on that aren't going to be recorded in the Gospels. Next, we have Arian. Arian was a clergy person in training. He was in the city of Alexandria down there in Egypt. Notice how sort of all these obscure places come into play. Arian was a clergyman. He stated that above all else, God is one. God is of one substance. God is indivisible. There is only one God. Keep in mind, we're living in cultures that had many, many gods. So there is only one God, and there is nothing, there is no one who is God's equal. So therefore, by deduction, Jesus is what?
Not God.
Not God. Jesus is not like God. Jesus is different than God. Jesus is human. Jesus is like us. We are not like God. Well, you can kind of buy that, can't you? There's a certain sense to that. Since God is indivisible, then God can't give birth to another person because that would not be God. There is only one God. Now, all of this in Arian's mind was to present Jesus as a person you could identify with, a person who knew you knew Jesus, and you felt like this made sense. This wasn't magic. This wasn't something that was kind of beyond your ken. This was a kind of comfort it was intended. So at first, this wouldn't seem to any of us like a heresy, but we'll get to that. Okay, the third one, Gnosticism. Some of you have heard of. I've talked about Gnosticism. Gnosticism is the sense that there are things that are secret, like secret societies. There are secret truths about life that we will share with you if you promise not to share them with anybody else. The world is divided into good and evil. You and I live in the evil part. We know about evil. But you and I have in us a very small spark from the good. And the work of your life is to somehow get that spark to build and to push out all the evil in you. It is possible, if you really follow all the precepts and all the secrets that we teach you, that you might become almost divine. You have the chance to almost be like God. It's hard. You live in a place of evil, but with real struggle and real effort and following all the things we tell you, you may turn that divine spark into something that's no longer trapped by this evil body in which you live. And you can get out of there. You have to get the spiritual knowledge, you have to get it right. And Jesus is the messenger. Jesus brings the information that you need. But Jesus is only a messenger come to earth to help you become divine. This business about resurrection and crucifixion and all that simply doesn't hold water. Can you really believe that anybody gets resurrected? That's just kind of not the way the world works. And so Gnostics are going to free your body from the evil, from the sin, from the temptation, and have you kind of transcend this world and live in another kind of world. And finally, Marcion. Marcion was a guy not unlike Southern child evangelist. He was a great charismatic. He was quite the preacher. And he preached that the great apostle, and the great apostle was Paul, that great apostle had jettisoned the Hebrew Bible. Paul, when he was converted, had given up all this stuff about Judaism. In fact, Judaism was dangerous. We now have a faith called Christianity, in which we abandon Israel's angry, limited God, who created a world so deficient that it included things like scorpions and mosquitoes. Clearly, this world is not a world that God could have created or would have created, because it has incredible imperfections in it. And Paul's intention, unfortunately he was killed by the Romans, but Paul's intention was to turn believers to worship a higher, previously unknown God of love, who Jesus taught about for the very first time. So Paul is our hero. Paul met an untimely death. So we have these things going on. We have these kind of heresies that these other guys are going to try to do something about. And that takes us to one of the handouts that I gave you. If I can get one of those from over there. Chad, can you turn around and that's one. No, the other. Yeah, this one. We're going to talk about what the leaders of the church had to struggle with. And my Lord, the list goes on. As they're trying to build a church, what are we going to include as legitimate? What are we going to look to give us a foundation? Well, obviously the first thing, I'm just going down this list, so anything you want to say is fine, just jump in when you wish. It must have been approved and appreciated by other folks who had read it. They must somehow find it uplifting and useful in developing their faith. It probably meant they heard it somewhere. They may have heard it at home by somebody that a family member met on the road, or they may have heard it in their worship. Then the problem became that we had far too many Gospels. We probably, by the year 105 or 110, we probably had a dozen Gospels of varying lengths, of varying qualities. And how do you choose? Because those folks over in Smyrna like this gospel that Polycarp is supporting, but while those of us who are here in Corinth kind of like Luke. And so you've got all these competitions, and so there are a number of options about what to do about what gospels we're going to put in our collection. First of all, we have to have a gospel that doesn't bother anybody, because we don't want people coming to church hearing things in the gospel that are upsetting. We all know that, don't we? Yeah. So we don't want too many things we can't explain. Not a lot of mystery, etc. We have one, perhaps we should have one that somehow takes the best of each, a sort of compendium. So we only have one gospel, everybody learns it, everybody knows it, there's no contradictions. We all know the right stories. We know how to deal with these particular things. We'll slough the others off to the side for, casual reading on occasion. And then we have, and Marcion would have been a great proponent of this, we have to make sure, some of us would say, that this gospel or these gospels, they just can't have any reference to Judaism and to this kind of heritage and history, because it just causes too much conflict. How are you going to have people together when some say, well, the Jews were this and that and the other? So we'll just eliminate any conversation about Jews. So any Gospels that have those kind of stories, and of course, this is aimed at Matthew, as you can imagine. Matthew takes a hit, and Luke rises in the ascendancy, and Mark, well, Mark's Mark. So then we have to say, well, what does it mean to have scripture, right? I mean, so we got some gospels, we got some other writings, but which ones are important and which ones are just nice, but they don't do much for us? So then we have people sort of scrambling. Oh, well, you know, I read this letter from so-and-so, or my friend told me about what happened over there in Ephesus. And so we start getting then sort of campaigns, kind of a political set of campaigns for who we're going to elect. Who's going to get in and who's out, who's going to win, who's going to lose. Then we get to Paul. Well, by this time, I don't know, there are 15 or 20 letters of Paul. And who's going to decide which are the real letters of Paul? And we have a couple of ways of deciding that. One is if you're a linguist, sometimes you can read a letter that we're pretty sure Paul wrote and set beside that some other one that doesn't, you know, it's like novelists. They sound like themselves even after they write a couple of novels. So then we have this kind of slippery way of saying that couldn't have been Paul. It just couldn't have been. And others saying, no, yeah, I think it was. And so we have to take these many letters of Paul and decide which ones we're going to go for. Eventually, in the long run, they decide on 13, but it was a lot of choice. And even now, scholars will tell you some of the 13, no, they weren't written by Paul. But they're in, so they're in. Then we could say, well, one of the ways to decide about all these writings is to say that any were written while the disciples and their followers were still alive. Those are kind of more authentic. Those hew closer to the core here, to folks that knew folks who saw Jesus, you know, that kind of thing. So shall we just cut it off at the point of anything written after the last disciple died? It just doesn't make it. I mean, that's one kind of rationale for
Who was
this.
the last disciple to die?
Pardon?
Who was the last disciple to die?
I don't know, and I don't know what their theory was, but that was one of Ignatius's theory. He was from Antioch. Then should we just have local option? Should we just say that the church at Ephesus can have these 12, which all of us share, but they can have their favorites. Why not? It's what is spiritually feeding for them. And what the church at Ephesus doesn't have to have the same as the church at Smyrna. So we have a kind of core set of things, and then we have local things that work for that congregation. That gets us around a lot of political lobbying. You know, when you think about that. You see that go on in the present day, don't you? Yeah. And then they had a special problem because the book of Acts shows up, or the writing of Acts shows up, and it's attributed to the same person who wrote this gospel, and we like this gospel, so why wouldn't we like Acts? Well, one of the reasons not to like Acts is it tells the truth just a little too close to the bone. It makes some people look not so good, you know, and we don't want to harm anybody here. These are scriptures, and everybody should like them. And since Luke wrote it, or since the same person who wrote that gospel wrote it, I guess we're going to have to include it. But others are saying, you know, how long is this collection of things going to be? You can't put everything in. You don't need Acts. It happened after Jesus died. And then another way to talk about it is, well, whatever things sort of feed your hunger, whatever writings are meaningful to you. That in theory is great, but how in the world is going to decide that? It's easier to say, well, let's just cut it off when the last disciple died, than to say, let's only have the ones that touch your heart or are useful in understanding faith. So we get into 7 there on your list. And then some would say we should or shouldn't have those that are apocalyptic. And next week you'll see a list of apocalyptic things. But they took the word apocalyptic. Usually that means things beyond time, things after the second coming would come after the apocalypse, if you recall that from Revelation. Apocalypse is about the breaking, the ceasing, the ending of things, and a new era comes. And so we're going to rule out or rule in anything that talks about this future about which none of us know. Of course, it would seem that the way they chose to define apocalypse is writings that couldn't be verified. That was their use for the word apocalypse. Well, writings that can't be verified. Let's take the book of Revelation, for God's sake. Oh, really? How are you going to verify that? And how did that get in there? It's thinking of scholars is that the book of Revelation was the only writing written for the purpose of being in the New Testament. It was somebody trying to get some kind of sense of the future, the apocalypse, what life would look like after the resurrection, and get it in there so everybody had a kind of common sense of what it would be like, except Revelation it doesn't help itself much by giving any clarity or uniformity to things. And then we come to what is who's going to make the decision, and when the decision is made, is it final? Can it never be altered? I mean, can't we have like amendments 1 through 10? Can't we wait 100 years and realize that a couple of these just don't work? We'll put others in? Who's going to decide that? Well, ironically, it's the Romans who decide that, and we'll get to that next week. But as you kind of listen to this list of how they had to decide, let's speculate. Were you given the choice, how would you have decided? Get creative, come on. You don't have to worry, you can't get it wrong because it's already been decided. But you have books in the Bible you think are kind of, I probably never would read that one again. Martin Luther said that. Martin Luther had 5 books in the Bible that he said had to come out. They were just a waste. They were getting in the way. Well, one was James. Another one was Revelation. You can understand some of that, yeah. He had 3 others. How would you decide? Let it to somebody smarter than me to figure it out, right? Yeah.
I think I would have, I guess it would have been almost impossible, but I think I would have tried to choose ones that were cohesive and carried through one theme without too many contradictions.
Yeah. Let's keep it simple. Yeah. Until the people over there at Smyrna saying, I'm taking no Bible unless you include my piece in it. Yeah. Well, in about the year 315, the Romans are going to decide for us. We won't get to decide for ourselves. But we'll get to that next week about how finally all of this was brought together into one set of 27. See you then.